Racist millionaire mocks elderly black gardener while hosting party, not knowing he's a retired judge. Williams tugged at a stubborn root, feeling the rough earth shift beneath his gloved hands. The party was well underway behind him, laughter and the clinking of glasses drifting across the manicured lawn. He preferred it back here, near the roses, where the work made sense, where things grew in their own time, unrushed and unbothered by the noise of the world. But as always, peace never lasted long. "You missed a spot, old man." The voice came from behind him, slick with the kind of self-satisfaction Williams recognized instantly. It was the same tone he'd heard in courtrooms for decades, the voice of men who believed wealth granted them license to belittle others. Harris. Williams didn't bother to turn around. He'd been expecting something like this since the party started, though he had hoped the whiskey Harris had been nursing would keep the man distracted longer. He plucked the final weed from the flower bed and stood slowly, brushing the soil from his knees. No rush. Not for men like this. Harris stepped closer, the glass in his hand sloshing slightly as he gestured lazily toward the hedges. "That's the problem with people like you," he said, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. "Work your whole life and all you've got to show for it is some dirt on your hands. Funny, isn't it? Some of us rise to the top and some of us—" He trailed off, eyes narrowing with mock pity as he gave Williams a once-over. "Well, some of us trim hedges." Laughter bubbled up from a few onlookers. It wasn't genuine, though. Williams recognized it for what it was. People laughing because they thought they were supposed to. Because Harris paid for their drinks, their dinner, their comfort. Williams turned to face him now, letting the silence stretch between them. Harris thrived on attention, on reaction, and Williams had no intention of giving it to him. Not yet. He met Harris's gaze, noting the way the man's confidence seemed to swell the longer Williams stayed quiet. The corner of Harris's mouth twisted upward. "Not much to say, huh?" He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if offering some personal, hard-earned wisdom. "That's the way it goes for people like you, born to serve." Williams didn't flinch. His face remained unreadable, betraying nothing, but inside, he felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The courtroom might be far behind him, but men like Harris were everywhere. Men who believed power came from money and cruelty. For a moment, memories of Harris's trial flashed before him. Years ago, Harris had been on the brink of financial ruin, caught up in a web of fraudulent real estate deals. He'd stood in front of Williams, pleading for mercy, his lawyer spinning a tale of second chances and reform. Williams had believed him back then, seen a glimmer of potential for change. And now, here they were. "A man's fortune," Williams said at last, his voice steady, is tied not to his wealth, but his deeds." The words landed with the weight of something unshakable, but Harris, predictably, didn't understand. His smirk widened as if he'd won some unspoken argument. He let out a short laugh, glancing over his shoulder at the few guests who lingered nearby. "What's that supposed to mean? You been reading fortune cookies again, old man?" A few chuckles rose from the onlookers, but this time the laughter was thin, uneasy. Williams watched the shift in the crowd, saw how even those in Harris's orbit were starting to pick up on the tension. He could feel the moment hanging there between them, a delicate thing, ready to tip. But Harris wasn't done. He stepped closer, the alcohol on his breath pungent now. "You think you're better than me? Is that it? Standing there all high and mighty because you know your way around a few plants?" He sneered. "Let me tell you something. This estate, these people, they're mine. You're just here because I let you be." Williams met Harris's gaze, calm as ever. There was no point in arguing with him. Men like Harris didn't understand the value of silence. They only understood power, and Harris believed he had it all. The air between them thickened, the murmurs of the party dulling in the background. Williams could feel eyes on him now, more than before. Mrs. Collins, one of the guests at the party, had wandered closer, watching the exchange intently. He recognized her from legal circles, though he doubted Harris knew that. Collins had the kind of quiet observation Williams admired. She was always thinking, always piecing things together. Harris leaned in, his voice dropping to a low hiss meant just for Williams. "You're nothing but a gardener, Charlie. That's all you'll ever be." Williams didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait. He simply looked Harris in the eye and repeated calmly, "A man's fortune is tied to his deeds. This time there was no laughter. The words hung in the air, heavier now. Something had shifted, though Harris was too far gone in his arrogance to notice. But Williams saw it. The crowd, the onlookers. They were waiting now, waiting to see what would happen next. And Williams, as always, was patient. Harris, emboldened by what he perceived as victory, sneered. "You think you're so wise, don't you? Let me tell you something. Wisdom doesn't pay the bills, and it sure as hell doesn't buy you a seat at this table." Williams didn't respond. There was no need. Instead, he let his gaze drift past Harris, over to the glass statue Harris had commissioned, a towering, delicate thing that stood in the middle of the garden, a symbol of Harris's supposed strength and success. But Williams saw it for what it was, fragile, easily shattered. Before Harris could continue, Mrs. Collins stepped forward, her voice breaking the silence. "You should watch your words, Mr. Harris," she said, her tone sharp but calm. "You might not know who you're talking to." Harris blinked. Caught off guard for the first time, he turned to face her, frowning. "What are you talking about?" Collins smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Williams here isn't just a gardener. He's the retired judge who presided over your case all those years ago. The man who showed you mercy when you were facing bankruptcy and prison time." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Harris's smirk faltered, the color draining from his face as he looked back at Williams, truly seeing him for the first time. The silence stretched on, thicker than before, and this time, no one laughed. Williams watched as the truth sank in, watched the way Harris's confidence wavered. But still, he said nothing. His silence was all that was needed now. Harris's lips parted, but no words came. He looked around as though someone in the crowd might step in and declare this all a joke. His breath caught in his throat, the cold reality settling deeper with each passing second. Williams held his gaze, calm and unyielding, the weight of years spent in the courtroom lingering in his eyes. There was nothing left to say, but everything in Harris screamed to deny it. You can't be serious," Harris managed, the words barely above a whisper, yet heard by all. His bravado cracked. No, you're a gardener." Mrs. Collins, standing nearby, crossed her arms and tilted her head slightly, watching the unraveling with quiet interest. "People can be more than one thing, Mr. Harris," she said softly. The undertone in her voice was unmistakable, meant as a subtle jab at his narrow worldview. Harris's jaw tightened as he whipped his head around to face her, desperate for an ally, but finding none. He searched the eyes of the surrounding guests, but what he found there was no longer admiration, no longer laughter at his crude jokes. It was something different now. Confusion, judgment, maybe even pity. That hit harder than any insult ever could. Williams bent down slowly, retrieving the hedge clippers that Harris had knocked from his hand. The simple act, a man reclaiming his work, punctuated the silence. It was deliberate, controlled. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. He had spent a lifetime around men like Harris, powerful on the surface, but fragile underneath, like the glass statue that loomed behind them. "That case," Harris stammered, his voice strained, "that was years ago. What are you even doing here?" Williams, still kneeling, began trimming the hedges again, as though nothing had changed. His steady hands moved with the same practiced precision as they had in the courtroom. "I enjoy the work," he said simply. "Enjoy the work." Harris stared at him, dumbfounded, as though the idea of a man like Williams finding peace in something so simple, so beneath him in Harris's mind, was incomprehensible. "That's ridiculous," Harris scoffed, the bravado returning, though shakier now. "You're, punishing me? Is that what this is?" His eyes narrowed, the desperation fueling his attempts to regain control. "You think this is funny? Coming here, pretending to be a nobody?" Williams didn't look up. His clippers snipped at a rogue branch, the sound cutting through Harris's babbling. It wasn't a game. It never had been. "No games, Mr. Harris," Williams finally said, standing up again and meeting Harris's gaze. "Not tonight." The simple response was like a blow to Harris's chest. He opened his mouth to respond, to argue, but the words didn't come. The crowd, once entertained by his antics, had grown quieter, more distant. It was as if they no longer wanted to be associated with the man they had laughed with just moments ago. Harris turned on his heel, storming away from the gathering, his mind racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was the one in control. He had the wealth, the estate, the guests. He had the power. And yet, as he moved through the party, he felt it slipping, like sand through his fingers. Williams watched him leave, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to follow. Harris would come back. Men like him always did. The reckoning wasn't over. It had barely begun. As Williams resumed his work, Ms. Collins walked closer, her curiosity still piqued. "I've heard about you, Judge Williams," she said softly, her voice more respectful now. "I wasn't sure it was really you when I saw you here." Williams smiled faintly, though his eyes remained on the hedges. "I'm just the gardener tonight." Collins gave a small laugh, though it wasn't mocking. A judge who becomes a gardener in his retirement. That's quite the turn. "It's not about what you do, Mrs. Collins. It's about how you do it." She watched him for a moment, intrigued by the layers beneath the surface. This was a man who had walked away from power, but still carried it in ways most people couldn't comprehend. There was something profound in his simplicity, something that set him apart from the men who strutted around this party like kings. "I think you rattled him," Collins remarked, glancing toward the mansion where Harris had disappeared. Williams paused, considering her words. "Rattling men like him doesn't do much," he said quietly. "They don't change unless they have no other choice." Collins's brow furrowed. "And you think he's going to change?" Williams didn't answer immediately. He let the quiet stretch between them, feeling the rhythm of the night settle in once again. Finally, he straightened and looked toward the mansion. "I don't know, but that's not up to me." Collins nodded, sensing there was more to the story, more to Williams than he was willing to share just yet. She respected that. Men like Williams didn't need to explain themselves. Their actions spoke loud enough. As the evening wore on, the party gradually returned to its usual hum of conversation and music, though the earlier energy had dampened. The guests were quieter, their laughter softer, as if something in the air had shifted permanently. Inside, Harris paced back and forth in his study, his heart pounding in his chest. He could still hear Williams's words echoing in his mind. His deeds. He had gotten away with it all those years ago. He had convinced the judge that he was worthy of a second chance. But now the judge was here, and he had the power to bring it all crashing down. He slammed his fist on the desk, the sudden movement knocking over a glass of whiskey. It spilled across the papers strewn about, staining them dark. Harris cursed under his breath, wiping at the mess with his sleeve. But the damage was done. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating. He grabbed his phone, fumbling with the screen as he dialed his lawyer. "Pick up," he muttered, pacing again. "Come on, pick up." Voicemail. Harris threw the phone onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not after everything he had built. He had the connections, the influence. He wasn't the same man who had stood in that courtroom all those years ago, pleading for leniency. He was James Harris, the self-made millionaire. But Williams had seen through that before. And now here he was, back again. Wow. Harris didn't believe in coincidences. He knew better than that. This was planned. This was retribution. The party outside had taken on a strange energy. The music still played, but the laughter was thinner, more subdued, as if everyone could feel the storm clouds gathering over the estate. Harris could feel it too, the pressure mounting in his chest. He wasn't used to this, being on the back foot, being made to feel small. Williams had done that man with his quiet, infuriating calm. A man who didn't even raise his voice but had turned the party inside out with a few words. Harris stormed back out of his study, determined to reclaim control. He found himself walking briskly toward the garden, scanning the crowd for Williams. He wouldn't let this go. He couldn't. He had to remind everyone who he was, remind them that James Harris was untouchable. He had the money, the influence. Williams was just a relic, a man who had stepped out of power and buried himself in dirt. As he neared the garden's edge, Harris spotted Williams, still quietly working. The man was calm as ever, pruning the hedges with that maddening focus. A small group of guests lingered nearby, watching Harris as he approached, their faces masks of polite curiosity. Harris's pulse quickened, though he kept his voice measured. "You know, Williams," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "it's funny how you talk about deeds and fortunes, because from where I stand, It looks like your fortune led you straight back to the garden. Meanwhile, mine, well, I've got all this." He gestured grandly toward the estate, his hands sweeping through the air like a king surveying his kingdom. But even as he spoke, he could feel the weight of their gazes on him. He could feel the cracks in his own facade, the sweat beating at the back of his neck. Williams didn't rise to the bait. He simply clipped another branch, his motions slow and deliberate. "Fortunes change, Mr. Harris," Williams said quietly, the soft tone somehow carrying more weight than any raised voice ever could. "You should know that better than anyone." Harris's jaw clenched. His control was slipping. He could feel it. He took another step forward, his shoes crunching on the gravel path. "I don't need a lecture from you, Williams," he snapped, his voice rising now. "I know how the world works. I built this. All of it. You're nothing but a man who stepped down, who chose to be this." Williams finally turned, standing up straight, his hands still resting calmly on the shears. His eyes locked onto Harris, and for a moment, there was something in his gaze that stopped Harris cold. A deep, unshakable knowing, like Williams had seen men like him 100 times before and knew exactly how this would end. "You might want to be careful, Mr. Harris," Williams said, his voice still calm. "Some things aren't as solid as they appear." Harris sneered. "What's that supposed to mean?" Williams's gaze shifted, ever so slightly, toward the glass statue at the center of the garden. The towering figure of delicate glass, commissioned by Harris to symbolize strength and triumph, shimmered in the evening light. Harris followed his gaze, then scoffed. "That statue? You think I care what you think of it?" He laughed, but it was a hollow sound, forced and thin. "I built this place from the ground up, and that's just the beginning. You've been reduced to trimming my hedges." A few guests exchanged uneasy glances, the tension thickening. Harris's words didn't land the way he had hoped. He could feel it slipping further. The crowd wasn't laughing this time. They were waiting for Williams to respond, waiting to see what would happen next. But Williams remained quiet, his silence drawing out the moment. It was infuriating. Harris needed more. He needed a win. He stepped forward again, his voice dropping to a low growl, meant only for Williams. "Don't think for a second you can play me, old man. This is my world, and you're just here because I allow it." Williams didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His eyes held steady, calm, and resolute. And in that silence, Harris felt something cold creep up his spine. The power dynamic was shifting, and Harris could sense it slipping out of his grasp. The garden suddenly felt too small, the walls closing in. Before Harris could press further, Mrs. Collins stepped forward from the gathering crowd. Her voice was steady but sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. "You should watch your words, Mr. Harris," she said, her tone carrying a quiet authority. "Judge Williams isn't someone you can simply brush aside." Harris spun on her, his face twisted in frustration. "What the hell are you talking about?" Collins held his gaze, unfazed by his outburst. "You remember the case, don't you? Years ago when you were facing financial ruin and the courts were closing in?" She didn't wait for him to respond. "Judge Williams was the one who spared you, the man who handed down the lenient sentence that saved your career. And now you're here, insulting him like he's nothing." Harris's breath hitched. For a split second, the world around him seemed to tilt, as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted without warning. He blinked, glancing back at Williams, searching for the truth in his expression. Williams didn't need to say anything. His silence was confirmation enough. Harris's stomach dropped, a cold wave of panic spreading through his chest. The judge. His mind raced, scrambling to remember the details, to find some way to deny it. But it was all true. It had been Williams, the man he'd begged for mercy, the man who had shown him leniency when no one else would. And now he was here, watching Harris unravel. "No," Harris muttered, his voice hoarse. "No, this can't be right. He took a step back, his eyes wide, searching for some explanation, some way to escape the truth. "You're just a gardener." Mrs. Collins crossed her arms, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Not just a gardener. You might want to start remembering who you're dealing with." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. Harris's mind spun, searching for a way out, but there was none. The weight of the realization crushed down on him, heavy and inescapable. The man he had mocked, the man he had tried to belittle in front of his guests, was the very man who held the power to destroy him, and Williams hadn't even had to raise his voice. The guests around them were quiet now, their earlier amusement replaced with a sharp, uncomfortable silence. Harris could feel their eyes on him, their judgment weighing him down. He tried to gather himself to reassert control, but the words wouldn't come. Williams, for his part, simply watched, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to say anything more. The truth was already out, and Harris was left to confront the full extent of his humiliation. Harris's hands shook as he shoved them into his pockets, trying to steady himself. The sweat on the back of his neck felt cold now, like the night air had suddenly shifted. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of just how precarious his position had become. He had to regain control. He had to turn this around before it all slipped through his fingers. "Listen," Harris said, his voice coming out too fast, too sharp. "Whatever this is, this whole situation, it doesn't have to go any further." He forced a grin that didn't reach his eyes, stepping closer to Williams. "You've made your point, okay? You've got everyone's attention, but let's not get carried away." Williams stood still, watching Harris with that maddening calm. He wasn't a man easily moved by threats or flattery, and Harris could see it now. This wasn't going to be like all the other times he had bought his way out of a problem. "I'm not carrying anything, Mr. Harris," Williams said, his tone measured, his gaze unblinking. "You're the one digging a hole for yourself." The words hit hard, and Harris felt the ground beneath him grow even shakier. For the first time that night, he wasn't sure if he could climb out of this one. He took a step back, his breath catching as the panic he'd been trying to bury finally clawed its way to the surface. "I don't need a lecture," Harris snapped. Louder than he meant to, the eyes of the guests bore into him like 1,000 needles. "This is my house, my party. You're just here because I—" He stopped short, realizing that finishing the sentence would only dig him deeper. "Because I let you be." The words hung unspoken between them, understood by everyone present. Mrs. Collins watched from the edge of the group, her expression impassive, but her eyes sharp. She could see it. Harris was flailing, and there was no saving face now. Williams, meanwhile, hadn't moved. His silence, his restraint, was far more powerful than anything Harris could say or do. Desperate, Harris tried another approach. He leaned in, lowering his voice, though the thin crowd could still hear the venom in his words. "I've got connections, Williams," he hissed, attempting to sound menacing, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You think just because you're some retired judge, you can come here and humiliate me in front of my guests? Don't forget who you're dealing with." Williams tilted his head slightly, as if considering Harris's threat. His eyes remained steady, though, unmoved by the bravado Harris was trying to summon. "I haven't forgotten a thing," Williams said, his voice soft but firm. The weight of experience laced through every syllable. Harris flinched. He knew that voice, that tone. It was the same voice that had once delivered his judgment in a courtroom, the same tone that had spared him from losing everything. And now that voice was reminding him that mercy wasn't owed. It had been a gift, and one that could be revoked at any time. The panic that had been building inside Harris erupted in a wave of anger. He turned sharply, walking toward the glass statue that stood at the center of the garden, his steps fast and frantic. He needed to assert himself, to show everyone he was still in control. He reached the base of the statue, the glass reflecting the pale light of the lanterns scattered around the estate. "This statue," Harris began, his voice louder now, directed at the crowd that had gathered, "is a symbol of everything I've built, everything I've accomplished. You all see this, right?" He gestured wildly at the towering figure of glass, his movements erratic. "This is strength. This is success." The guests watched him in silence, their expressions ranging from discomfort to outright concern. The more Harris spoke, the more he unraveled, his words ringing hollow in the night air. Williams remained by the hedge, his hands folded in front of him. He didn't need to follow Harris. He didn't need to respond. The unraveling was happening on its own. Harris turned back to face Williams, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "What do you have, huh? What do you have to show for all your wisdom, all your righteous talk about deeds and fortunes?" He pointed a shaking finger at Williams, his voice cracking with frustration. "You're nothing but a man with a pair of clippers." Williams's calm gaze never wavered, his silence growing louder with every passing second. Harris's outburst had the opposite effect than he intended. Instead of reasserting control, it highlighted just how much of it he had lost. Mrs. Collins stepped forward slightly, her expression unreadable. "I think that's enough, Mr. Harris," she said quietly, though her voice carried in the stillness of the garden. "You're embarrassing yourself." The words cut through the tension like a knife. Harris's breath hitched in his chest, and for a moment he froze, unsure of how to respond. The crowd was watching him, judging him. He could feel their eyes, their unspoken criticism weighing him down. The man who had once commanded attention and admiration was now a spectacle, and everyone knew it. Harris turned back to the statue, his eyes wild, his breathing erratic. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of everything he had built crashing down around him. He needed to do something, anything, to regain control, to show them all that he was still the man he had always been. Without thinking, Harris reached out and grabbed one of the smaller glass components of the statue, ripping it free from its delicate base. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the garden, and a collective gasp rose from the guests. Harris stood there, panting, holding the broken piece in his hand like a weapon. But instead of feeling powerful, Harris felt something else entirely, something much worse. He felt weak, exposed. Williams took a step forward now, just one, his eyes on the broken statue, then on Harris. "Careful," Williams said, his voice as even as ever. "You might cut yourself." Harris's grip tightened on the shard of glass, his knuckles turning white. The rage and fear inside him swirled together, choking him. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but he was frozen in place, trapped by his own actions. The crowd remained silent, watching as Harris's empire crumbled in front of them, piece by piece. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Harris dropped the shard of glass. It fell to the ground with a soft thud, the sound barely audible over the pounding of his heart. William stepped back, his expression unchanged, and turned to leave the garden. There was nothing left to say. The truth had already spoken for itself. Harris stood frozen, his heart thudding in his chest, the sound of shattering glass still echoing in his mind. The broken piece of the statue lay at his feet, the symbol of everything he had built, now a fragile mess on the ground. He could feel the eyes of his guests on him, judging, questioning. His fingers itched, his body tense, but he had no idea what to do next. Williams was gone, walking away as if nothing had happened, as if he had won without needing to say a word. Harris's hands clenched into fists, his breath coming fast and shallow. He can't walk away like that, not after what had just happened, not after the way he'd turned the entire evening into a spectacle. Harris had to do something. He had to get back in control. He stormed through the crowd, ignoring the murmurs and awkward glances. The guests parted for him as he moved, their hushed whispers buzzing in his ears. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't even looking at him with respect. There was something else in their eyes now, something worse. Pity. He could feel it pressing down on him, suffocating him. His world was spinning out of control, and every step he took felt heavier, like he was sinking deeper into quicksand. As he passed the large double doors leading inside the mansion, he yanked them open with a growl, the wood groaning under his grip. Once inside, the noise from the party outside faded into a low hum, leaving him alone with his thoughts, and the echo of Williams's calm, measured voice. Harris grabbed the nearest chair and slammed it against the wall, the sharp crack of wood breaking the silence. He needed to vent, to release the frustration building inside him, but nothing was enough. Every punch, every broken object only made the feeling worse. The phone on his desk buzzed, snapping him out of his frenzy. He stumbled toward it, nearly tripping over his own feet. His lawyer's name flashed on the screen. Harris's stomach flipped as he swiped to answer the call, his hands still shaking. "About time," he growled, his voice hoarse. "What's going on, James?" his lawyer Michael asked. The concern in his voice was palpable, but Harris didn't have time for pleasantries. "You need to fix this," Harris spat, pacing the room. "You need to fix it now." "Fix what? What happened?" Harris gritted his teeth. "Williams, Judge Williams, he's here. He's at my house. He's making a scene, trying to humiliate me in front of everyone. You need to stop this." There was a pause on the other end, the kind that stretched just a second too long and made Harris's chest tighten with unease. James, Michael's voice was low, hesitant. Williams isn't just some retiree, you know that. If he's involved, I don't care what he is, Harris interrupted, his voice cracking. You don't understand. I've already been through this with him once. If he's here, if he's pulling strings, then my whole world could come crashing down. You need to find out what's going on. There was another long pause, and Harris's patience was wearing thin. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. His entire career, his entire fortune was on the line. Everything he had worked for could be gone in an instant if Williams decided to strike. He couldn't afford another mistake. James, Michael finally said, his voice more serious now. I'm looking into it, but if there's something happening behind the scenes, it might be bigger than you think. I've been hearing rumblings, things about an investigation into some of your deals. You might want to lay low for a while. Harris felt his pulse spike. An investigation. The word alone sent a wave of panic crashing through him. This couldn't be happening. Not now, not after he had clawed his way to the top. What kind of investigation? Harris demanded, pacing more frantically now. Real estate fraud, Michael said slowly. I'm not saying it's official, but I've heard whispers, and if Williams is involved. Harris's vision blurred as the gravity of the situation slammed into him. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. He could barely hear Michael on the other end, the lawyer's voice muffled by the ringing in Harris's ears. You need to stop this, Harris repeated, though now his voice had lost its edge. He was pleading, desperate. I can't lose everything, not because of some old grudge. He has to be doing this because of the case, because of what happened back then. James, Michael sighed, and if Williams has his sights on you again, this isn't something I can fix overnight. You need to prepare for the worst. If the investigation moves forward, we're looking at legal battles, media attention, maybe even criminal charges. It's serious. Harris felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His entire world, the empire he had built with his own hands, was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He stumbled back to his desk, gripping the edge to steady himself. I need time, Harris whispered, the fight draining out of him. I need more time. Michael's voice was grim. You might not have it. Harris hung up the phone, staring at the blinking screen, the lawyer's words echoing in his mind. The walls of his office felt like they were closing in, the air growing thicker, heavier. He was trapped, no way out. His chest heaved, panic rising as he realized that Williams didn't have to do anything at all. The damage was already done. He looked toward the window, toward the garden where Williams had been working just moments ago, as if nothing was wrong, as if everything wasn't falling apart. Harris's fist clenched again, but this time there was no anger left, only fear. His empire wasn't built on solid ground. It was glass, fragile and easy to shatter. And Williams had just walked away, leaving the pieces to fall apart on their own. The sound of footsteps approaching the study snapped Harris back to the moment. The door opened, and one of the party's guests, a young executive from one of Harris's companies, poked his head in. Mr. Harris, he said carefully, eyeing the shattered chair and scattered papers. The guests are starting to ask questions. Is everything okay? Harris swallowed hard, forcing his face into something resembling calm. He couldn't let them see. Not yet. Everything's fine, he said, his voice strained. Just tell them I'll be back out shortly. The executive hesitated, glancing nervously at the wreckage in the room before nodding and slipping back out. The door clicked shut, leaving Harris alone again. But the silence was no longer comforting. It was oppressive. His chest tightened as he slumped into the nearest chair, his mind racing through every possible outcome. He wasn't just worried about losing the party, he was terrified of losing everything. And worse, he knew deep down that it wasn't just the investigation. It wasn't just the business deals. It was Williams. The man had seen through him once before, and now he was back. And this time, there would be no second chances. Harris sat in the chair, his fingers digging into the leather arms as his mind raced. The echo of Michael's voice still lingered, each word cutting through him like a blade. Real estate fraud, media attention, criminal charges. It was all happening too fast. The foundations of everything he'd built, his wealth, his reputation, were starting to crack, and he had no idea how to stop it. Williams. The name sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through him. Harris couldn't shake the image of the old man standing there in his garden, so calm, so steady, as though none of this touched him. But it did touch him. It had to. Williams had made this happen. He had planted the seeds long ago when he spared Harris from the worst of his crimes, and now he was back to watch it all burn. The party outside had faded into the background, its energy sucked away by the tension that clung to Harris's chest. His world was shrinking, the walls of the mansion pressing in on him. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to think, trying to find a way out. Think, damn it. He couldn't let this happen. He had come too far, clawed his way to the top, and he couldn't go back to where he had been all those years ago, begging for leniency in front of Williams. No, this couldn't be happening. Not again. With shaking hands, Harris grabbed his phone again, dialing Michael once more. His pulse quickened as the line rang, each second stretching out like an eternity. "James," Michael answered after the third ring. "What now?" Harris's throat tightened, the words almost sticking in his chest. "You said there's an investigation. What do we do? There has to be something we can—" "James," Michael cut him off, his voice firm, "this isn't a quick fix situation. I can't just make it go away. If Williams is involved, hell, if he's even aware of this investigation, you're in serious trouble. You need to prepare." "Prepare for what?" Harris snapped. Rising from the chair and pacing again, his fingers clenching the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. "I'm not going to jail, Michael. I can't—" "There's a very real chance you could," Michael said, his voice hard, cold. "If the evidence is there, if this investigation gets traction, we're looking at a full-scale collapse. Not just your career, not just the company. You." Harris's heart pounded in his chest. He could barely breathe. You. The word hung in the air. A death sentence. There was no way out. "There has to be something," Harris stammered, running a hand over his face. "What about Williams? Can't you get to him? Can't you—" "What?" Michael asked, incredulous. "Threaten him? Bribe him? Jesus, James, you think a retired judge like Williams is going to play ball after all this? No, this is bigger than him now. You need to focus on mitigating the damage, not trying to drag him down with you." Harris shook his head, his skin crawling with desperation. The fear was overwhelming, clawing at him, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. He could hear his own pulse in his ears, the sound deafening in the suffocating silence of the room. "I can't go back," Harris whispered, more to himself than to Michael. His mind raced, spinning back to that courtroom all those years ago when he had stood in front of Williams, begging for a second chance. Williams had given it to him then, believing, hoping he would change. But Harris hadn't, and now Williams was back, and there was no mercy left. "You need to listen to me, James," Michael said, his voice cutting through the panic. "You need to figure out what to do next. You can't panic, you can't lose control, or you'll lose everything." Harris's eyes flickered toward the window, toward the garden where the glass statue stood, fragile and towering over the party. The partygoers had started to drift back into their conversations, but the energy was still tense, still off. He knew they were all whispering about him, about what had happened. He knew they were watching, waiting to see how far he would fall. "I need time," Harris said again, his voice trembling. "Just buy me some time." Michael let out a long sigh. "I'll see what I can do," he said, though the doubt in his voice was unmistakable. "But James, you need to prepare for the worst. I can't promise anything." Harris hung up the phone without another word. His chest heaved as he tried to calm himself. But it was useless. The panic had already taken hold, and there was no letting go now. He stood there staring out at the garden, his eyes locked on the glass statue. It gleamed in the dim light, fragile and beautiful, and so easily shattered. His fists clenched as a dark thought crossed his mind. Williams had let him live once, had spared him from the ruin he so richly deserved. But now, Williams wasn't a judge anymore. He was just a man with a grudge, with a vendetta. If Williams wanted to destroy him, then Harris would have to destroy him first. A surge of anger rushed through him, burning away the fear for just a moment. Harris's mind raced, his thoughts sharp, calculated. He could still win. He could still take back control. He would show Williams that James Harris wasn't some charity case, some helpless man begging for mercy. He was the one in control. He had the money, the power, the connections. All he needed was a plan, a way to turn the tables before Williams could strike again. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stand tall, forcing himself to push back the fear. He wasn't going to let Williams win. Not again. This was his world, his empire. And no man, no matter how righteous, was going to take it from him. As Harris stared out at the garden, his gaze fixed on the statue, the thought solidified in his mind. He would fight back. He would take Williams down before the judge could tear him apart. One way or another, Harris would survive this. The party outside had quieted, the murmur of conversation little more than a dull hum now. The guests were leaving, sensing that the evening had soured beyond repair. The night air was cool, and Harris could see his breath fogging the window as he stood there, staring out into the darkness. The mansion felt empty, hollow, as if all the grandeur and wealth that had once filled its halls had drained away, leaving only silence. The glass statue loomed in the distance, gleaming in the pale light of the lanterns. For a moment, Harris felt like it was mocking him, fragile, beautiful, and so close to breaking. Harris paced the length of his study, the dim light of the mansion casting long shadows across the room. The quiet had become unbearable. His mind raced, fragments of half-formed plans colliding with the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over him. He needed to think, to act, but every time he tried to focus, his thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. He couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. Williams, the name, once little more than an echo from his past, now loomed over him like a specter. No matter how hard he tried to push it away, it was there, unstoppable. The investigation, the whispers, the threats, they were all connected, and it all led back to Williams. Harris couldn't run from it any longer. But what could he do? Harris had always prided himself on being a man of action, someone who could take control, bend things to his will. Yet here he was, powerless, cornered in his own home. There has to be a way out. The door creaked open behind him, and Harris whirled around, his pulse spiking. One of his assistants stood there, hesitating in the doorway. "Mr. Harris," the young man began, his voice low. "The guests, they're leaving. Is everything all right?" "No, everything is not all right." Harris clenched his jaw, forcing himself to keep it together. "Fine," he snapped, waving his hand dismissively. "Let them leave. The party's over." The assistant nodded quickly and disappeared, shutting the door behind him. Harris stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, breathing heavily. The mansion suddenly felt too big, too empty. The weight of everything, his crumbling business, the investigation, and now Williams, pressed down on him from all sides. "I can't lose it all. Not like this." He grabbed his phone but hesitated before dialing. His mind flickered back to his last conversation with Michael. The lawyer had been clear. There was no easy fix. There was no bribing Williams, no threats that would make him back down. Harris had pushed too far, and now he was paying for it. His fingers hovered over the screen, shaking. There had to be someone else, someone who could help. What about the investigation? Harris thought frantically. Maybe he could find a way to buy time, to delay whatever was coming. But another part of him, the part that had always been able to read the room, knew it was too late for that. Williams wasn't the type to let things slide. And if there was even a chance that Williams was pulling the strings behind this investigation, Harris knew the odds were stacked against him. He had been given a second chance once, and he had squandered it. A sharp knock at the window startled him. Harris turned toward the noise, his breath catching. It wasn't the knock itself that unnerved him. It was the dark silhouette standing just outside, framed by the pale light of the garden lanterns. The figure's features were obscured by the shadows, but Harris knew instantly who it was. Williams. Harris's pulse quickened. He froze, staring at the figure outside, his mind racing through 1,000 scenarios. What was he doing out there? Why wasn't he leaving? Panic clawed at Harris's chest. He couldn't confront Williams now, not like this, not when he had nothing left to offer but his desperation. But the judge didn't move. He simply stood there, his posture calm, his gaze fixed on Harris through the glass. There was no malice in his stance, no visible threat, just the unshakable presence that had haunted Harris all night. Harris's hands trembled as he backed away from the window. He had been powerful once, hadn't he? He had been the man in charge, the one everyone feared and respected. But now, standing there, with Williams silently watching him from the garden, Harris felt small, exposed. He stumbled to the side, his mind spinning. He needed air. He needed space to think, to figure out a way to salvage this disaster. With a shaky breath, he rushed toward the back door, fumbling with the handle before throwing it open. The cool night air hit him like a wave as he stepped out into the garden. The silence was suffocating. The guests had left, the lights from the party dimming as the night wore on. Harris's eyes darted across the grounds, searching for Williams, but the judge was no longer in view. He took a few hesitant steps forward, his feet crunching on the gravel path, his breath fogging in the air. "Williams!" Harris called, his voice cracking in the stillness. "What do you want from me?" The only answer was the quiet rustling of the trees, the faint sound of wind brushing through the leaves. Harris's chest tightened. He could feel his grip on everything slipping, and the more he tried to hold on, the faster it all fell away. He moved deeper into the garden, the towering glass statue looming in the distance. The very sight of it, once a source of pride, now sent a shiver down his spine. Its fragility, its artificial grandeur, reminded him of how easily it could all be shattered, just like the empire he'd built. As he approached the statue, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. He spun around, his heart racing, and there, standing at the far edge of the garden, was Williams. The judge was calm, his hands tucked neatly into his coat pockets. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched. Harris's throat tightened as he marched toward him, his footsteps quickening with each step. "What do you want?" Harris demanded, his voice rising in desperation. "Is this what you wanted, to watch me fall apart?" Williams didn't answer, his expression remaining unchanged. The weight of his silence pressed down on Harris, suffocating him. The panic bubbled up again, sharp and uncontrollable. "You think you can do this to me?" Harris shouted, his voice raw with fear. "I won't let you take everything. I'll fight back. I'll destroy you before you destroy me." Williams raised an eyebrow, the calm look in his eyes completely unaffected by Harris's outburst. "Mr. Harris," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm not the one doing the destroying." The words hit Harris harder than any threat could have. He stopped in his tracks, the truth of Williams's statement sinking in. It wasn't Williams who had destroyed him. It wasn't the judge's hand that had set the investigation in motion or led to this moment of collapse. It had been Harris all along. His own arrogance, his own greed, had planted the seeds of his downfall. And now, standing there, he couldn't ignore it any longer. The silence stretched between them, heavy and undeniable. For the first time in his life, Harris was truly powerless, and the realization left him paralyzed. I don't, Harris stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The rage had drained from him, replaced by a hollow sense of defeat. Williams watched him for a long moment before speaking again. "It's never been about me, Mr. Harris. The choices you made, those were your own." Harris swallowed hard, his throat tight. He looked past Williams, his gaze drawn once again to the glass statue in the center of the garden. It gleamed in the moonlight, beautiful and fragile, a reflection of everything Harris had built. And for the first time he saw it for what it truly was, a monument to his own arrogance. He turned back to Williams, the words sticking in his throat. What do I do now?" Williams didn't answer immediately. He let the question hang in the air, as if giving Harris the space to understand the weight of it. "That's up to you," he said quietly, his eyes steady. "But I think you already know." Harris stood there, frozen, the weight of Williams's words pressing down on him like an unbearable load. His mind raced, grasping for a way out, but there was no escape this time. Williams hadn't destroyed him. No, it had been him all along. Every decision, every manipulation, every time he'd cut corners, believing he was untouchable. It had led him here. He looked past Williams, toward the mansion, the garden, the shattered statue. Everything around him was a reflection of his life. A life built on a fragile foundation of lies and illusions, one that could shatter with the slightest push. And now it had. The glass statue, still gleaming in the moonlight, looked even more delicate than before. The piece Harris had broken off earlier lay on the ground, a shard of what had once stood tall, unblemished. He remembered how proud he had been of that statue, how it had symbolized his rise, his power. But now, looking at it through Williams's calm gaze, He saw the truth. It was all fragile. Everything. His wealth, his reputation, his empire. It was built on nothing but sand. Harris started, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know it would come to this. Williams remained still, watching Harris closely, his eyes full of quiet understanding. He didn't offer pity or judgment. He didn't need to. The truth was enough. The choices you made, Williams repeated, his voice steady, brought you here, but you always had a choice. Harris's shoulders slumped, the full weight of his actions crashing down on him. He felt small, smaller than he had ever felt before. In his chest, the fear had twisted into something deeper, something closer to resignation. He had fought so hard, grasped for so much, and in the end, he had nothing. Nothing but the consequences of his own making. Williams' calm voice cut through the silence. You can't outrun your past forever, Mr. Harris. Harris turned slowly, his eyes lingering on the statue for just a moment longer, before looking back at Williams. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. What happens now? Williams didn't answer right away. He let the question hang in the air, his gaze never leaving Harris. It was as though he wanted Harris to understand fully before he spoke again. That's up to you, he said, his voice quiet. But the reckoning always comes. Harris nodded slowly, his mind finally starting to grasp the full scope of what lay ahead. He didn't have to ask Williams what the reckoning would be. He already knew. The investigation, the lawsuits, the media storm, it was all coming for him, and there was no stopping it. His empire was crumbling, and this time, no amount of money or power would save him. He could feel it deep in his chest, that gnawing sense of inevitability. Everything he had built was gone. The question now was whether he would go down with it or whether he could salvage anything from the ruins. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken truths, with the weight of everything that had happened, everything that was still to come. Harris looked down at his hands, once so steady, so sure, now trembling. The fight had drained out of him, leaving only the raw fear of what awaited. He could no longer run from it. All he could do now was face the consequences. He turned back to the mansion, the faint light from the windows casting long shadows across the lawn. The guests were gone, the party long over. The silence hung heavy in the night air, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I can't fix this, can I? Harris's voice was low, almost to himself. Williams didn't answer right away. His eyes softened, just a fraction. No, he said quietly, but you can stop making it worse. Harris nodded, his chest tightening with something like grief. Not for the empire he was about to lose, but for the man he had become in the pursuit of it. He had spent so long chasing power, money, and status that he had forgotten the simple truths that Williams had spoken earlier that night. It wasn't about wealth. It was about deeds. Harris's mind flashed back to the courtroom all those years ago. He remembered the look in Williams's eyes as the judge had granted him leniency, believing that he would change, that he would make something better of himself. Instead, Harris had doubled down on the very things that had brought him to ruin in the first place. And now, here they were again. The statue in the garden stood as a testament to everything Harris had once valued, everything that had led him down this path. And now it was broken, just like everything else in his life. For the first time, Harris felt the weight of that brokenness. He had spent his entire life building something fragile, something false. And in the end, it had all crumbled in his hands. He turned back to Williams, his face pale, his voice weak. What do I do now? Williams looked at him, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, something calm, almost resigned. You face the truth, he said quietly, and then you deal with the consequences. Harris swallowed hard. He knew what Williams meant. The investigation would come. The lawsuits, the media, everything he had done would come crashing down on him, and there was no way to stop it. All he could do now was face it. But as Harris stood there, staring at the broken pieces of his life, something inside him shifted. He was still afraid, still terrified of what lay ahead. But there was also something else, a quiet acceptance. He had run from his past long enough. It was time to stop running. He took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. For the first time in years, Harris felt something close to clarity. He wasn't going to fix this. He wasn't going to get out unscathed, but he could face it. He looked up at Williams, his eyes clear for the first time that night. "Thank you," he said, the words coming out quietly, almost reluctantly. But they were sincere. He knew now that Williams hadn't come to destroy him. He had come to remind him of something he had forgotten long ago, the importance of facing the truth. Williams nodded just once, then turned and began walking back toward the mansion, his figure disappearing into the shadows. Harris stood alone in the garden, staring up at the broken statue, the weight of his choices settling over him like a shroud. But this time, he didn't try to run from it. This time, he let it wash over him, knowing that the only way out was through. The night was quiet, the air cool and still. And for the first time in years, Harris felt something close to peace.